Valerie asks, can you get stuck in a particular grief cycle stage? And I think stereotypically the stage that
Can be sticky.
many associate with post-Mormons and stickiness is the stage of anger. What do you think, Margie? Can you get stuck in a stage? And if so, how do you get out of it? And what do you think the causes are of getting stuck in a stage? If you could attribute it to a specific set of behaviors that might contribute to stuckness.
Sure. Okay, well, some thoughts that come to mind would be, yes, I absolutely do feel like you can get stuck or feel stagnant, kind of stagnate in a stage. Some things that come to mind for me around that can be that you have a lot that you're trying to process at once that is can be particularly distressing, and you may need some support in order to kind of make your way through all that's going on. And that reminds me a little bit of compounded loss. There's a nature to loss sometimes where, it kind of trickles down, and it's like a nerve where it starts, and it starts one place, but what you end up having is all these reminders of past losses. And so that is something that happens in process, and you may need extra support in the way of kind of talking to a therapist or someone who's really trained to kind of help you work through that. So yes, I do feel like you can get, kind of stuck in a particular stage, and that's a good sign to kind of seek support and have a little extra care for yourself in that. Did I miss anything else?
Natasha, what do you think about getting stuck?
Yeah, I have some mixed feelings about it too, because none of us are probably going to complain about being stuck in the acceptance phase.
Right.
So there's certain things. It's kind of like,
and some people want to get stuck in the testing, not the testing phase, but the experimentation phase, like exploration phase. Some people don't want to ever stop exploring again. And so for them, exploring can be a lifelong endeavor. Instead of feeling like you've got everything figured out, now life is just a lifelong journey with no ground, but limitless possibilities. Anyway, keep going, Natasha. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's an interesting take too. I think how we use language is oftentimes, it's interesting. I mean, I see this a lot in the sex field, right? It's like we use problematic language for things that tend to be more taboo or, again, uncomfortable, instead of like nobody says that they're addicted to vanilla missionary position sex, even though that's what most people do all the time, right? But nobody's saying that they're addicted to that. So it's just kind of interesting to see our language. I think I am a little hesitant because like you've said, Margie, most people think about that in the anger or depression phases. I think the whole idea of the grief cycle is that it's normalizing that you're going to go through these phases to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so the amount of time, and so most of us are going to be uncomfortable with the anger or depression phases, even if they last a week or 3 weeks or a year. And it's also not fair to say that you're in full anger mode for an entire year. I mean, most people, they may have an anger kind of energy that's brewing, but they're still laughing and telling jokes. I mean, we're not like, again, super binary creatures. We're more complex than that. And at the same time, I will say, if you feel like you're in a negative relationship with one of these stages, maybe get a second opinion, have somebody you can talk to about it. What is making you feel, or what, a lot of times it's not you, it's your spouse or your adult child or somebody who'll be like, geez, you've been difficult lately, right? Or you've been hard to live with. So you're getting kind of clues from other people around you that you might be quote unquote stuck, or they're telling you that you seem stuck or angry all the time.
Right. And that can just be their impatience or their discomfort, mm-hmm. or unhealthy, like I said, emotional codependency, right?
Right. So is that accurate, or, is there something to that message, or is it their own things that they need to work through because they're not used to there being anything awry in this particular way, in your life together? So it's complicated. I guess I would say the simple answer is yes, but be careful to not, we're so quick to pathologize each other or ourselves when maybe these are just normal processes, but we do have to be intentional about them. I mean, I often use the metaphor of going to the gym. I'm not going to lose weight or get stronger by sitting around and thinking about it. I'm going to have to go and do something about it, and exercise and eat a certain way if I want results to be different than the results I get of sitting around on my couch.
Yep.
Love it. Amy, hey, Amy, we love you. Amy says, I heard it takes on average 3 to 7 years after a faith crisis to make a new normal. I've also heard like for every 10 years you were in the church, it takes at least a year to kind of grieve and rebuild. I'm sure we would all agree these are estimates and just, folk wisdom. But what do you guys think about a multi-year process? Let's say I'm on year 19.
I think we're always in process.
We're always in process. Yeah.
I think that happens until we're not here anymore.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I think what those types of timelines talk about is the normalcy of, yes, this, it's even when I do marriage therapy, for example, and people are coming in with a problem that they've been dealing with for 25 years, I kind of tell them, I can't put the magic wand or the fortune, kind of bulb and say, oh, if you do this, you'll for sure be done with your marital work by, April 2nd, 2 years from now. But I can say it's going to be longer than 3 months to turn around a 25-year-old process, right? Or to shift something that you've been engaging in for a long period of time. So yes, these are the ways we grew up. For many of us, these are the things that, have really played a role in how we're wired and how we problem solve and how we think about the world. And so when you're shifting all of that, yes, it's going to be a multi-year process. And like you're saying, Margie, maybe never ending in the sense that there's always opportunities for it to come up in some way or another. It doesn't mean that you're in full-blown crisis mode the rest of your life. It just means there'll be opportunities to revisit it.
Margie wants to read a comment from our wonderful friend, Erin.
Yeah, Erin writes, there also seems to be a panicky aspect to grief. Every so often I get flashes of panic with the unknown, feeling like I used to have answers for everything and now I don't. My new normal is not knowing and feeling at peace with it. I really love that. Groundlessness.
What do you mean by groundlessness?
Shout out to Noah, Rashida. Yeah, just this idea of, making peace with this sense of mystery that we all kind of live with, and learning to kind of navigate good coping amidst that, I think. So I just relate to it. I relate to that comment.
Yeah, just to let people know what we're talking about, Noah Rasheda has a podcast called Secular Buddhism Podcast. You can find it, I think it's secularbuddhism.com. But the episode is 93, Stepping into Groundlessness. And I know that just recently I was really needing to feel better about some things I was struggling with. And so as part of what I do at nights when I'm really having a hard time, I turn on Secular Buddhism Podcast when I can't sleep and I listen to it. And he's got this whole episode about how, and it comes straight from Buddhism, but control is an illusion. When we thought as Orthodox Mormons that we had everything under control, that everything was stable, that everything was solid, that everything was sure, that everything was reliable. And it may feel that way, but it's a myth. It's an illusion. People die randomly. Life has suffering. People get sick. Kids that you raise totally Orthodox can leave the church or even, really struggle. There's no way to control away,
your life.
The pain and suffering of life. Now, of course, you can add extra pain and suffering to the guaranteed pain that life is going to provide. So it's not that we're
your
saying
decisions don't matter.
Decisions matter, but absolutely, the more you try and control life to prevent that you'll experience any pain, it's called the happiness trap. The more you're likely guaranteeing you extra pain and suffering on top
Yeah.
of whatever pain life is going to just offer. And so even though Mormons or Orthodox Mormons sometimes have this false sense of security, that everything's great and that you're protected, there's no such thing as absolute protection. And there's no such thing as absolute certainty. And so what Noah encourages us to do in his Secular Buddhism podcast is to learn to get comfortable with discomfort, to get comfortable with uncertainty, to get comfortable with groundlessness, as he calls it. And that pays really, really important dividends later on. And so I'm going to provide a link to that episode in the comments of this section. And I just want to tell you, you cannot listen to this episode enough, episode 93 of Secular Buddhism Podcast. It is so incredibly powerful. So go support Noah Rasheta in his podcast.
And thank you, Aaron, for your comment.
Yeah. Natasha, anything you want to add to that?
No, I thought that was great. I love Noah's work.
Okay. Kara again writes, I think anger is such. Do you want to read Kara's comment, Natasha?
On the Facebook Live?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It starts out, I think anger. It's a little bit up.
I think anger is such an easy stage to get stuck in because it often is a secondary emotion. Below anger oftentimes is sadness, fear, etc. Emotions that often are more painful to deal with. And anger is such an easy emotion to go to. Not saying that anger is bad, but easy to be stuck in. Yeah, and I agree with that. We talked about that last week too, with this idea of there's usually something underlying the anger. And so when and I oftentimes invite people to kind of have, if you can, anger is so hard to deal with because it's part of that flight, freeze, fight, freeze response. Sorry. And that happens in nanoseconds, right? There's this book, it's called The Reptile Brain. It's kind of funny because we turn into, very quickly creatures that, lower IQ, lower ability to kind of reason in the moments when we kind of most need it, which is so interesting. We haven't evolved to our main danger being logical thought processes. We're still running away from saber-toothed tigers in our ways of dealing with this. So most of us are needing our intellect to deal with our current status of being upset, and yet our body is still getting us to climb a tree, right? So climbing trees isn't that useful today, at least not in most of our lives. And so I usually invite people that if you can, in those moments when you feel anger, can you take a second, if you at all can, to just notice where that's showing up in your body? And I've actually gotten pretty good at this over the years. So I now know that it shows up in my jaw and it shows up kind of in my upper neck, gets very tight, and it shows up in what my husband calls my ragey eyes, so my eyes get all squinty. Of course I was saying, what do you mean my ragey eyes? I don't have ragey eyes. And then I was like, oh, I guess I do. So it's taken me kind of some years to just tune into what my physiology does when it's angry. And when you get better at that, then the next step is, oh yeah, that's what my body's cluing me into. Then you can be more adept into asking those secondary questions. What's this really about? What's under this anger for me? And tuning into, the sadness that's usually easier to empathize with. And that's the problem with a lot of couple communication or even like friendships or, parent-child, is that we both get caught in this anger, diatribe where we're both defensive posture instead of like going, and so if you're the one in that position where you're like, whoa, what's mom, or what's my husband, or what's my wife, where's this coming from? If in that moment you can remember to go, like, what's this about? Or what's going on with you? Just asking an empathic, curious question instead of engaging in that defensive posture, sometimes it can help us get to those, those primary emotions that Kara's talking about.
Yes, yes.
which is where a lot more of the work is to be done.
We can't remind people of that enough. We did cover it last week, but if you can just, every time things get heated with a spouse or a child or a loved one, if you can just develop the habit of noticing that there's anger and then immediately making that move to say, I'm getting angry or you're getting angry, let's move to the primary emotion. How do you feel? Are you sad? Are you hurt? Are you scared? I feel sad. I feel hurt. I feel scared. And if you can move that conversation to each of you expressing what you're sad about, what you're scared about, immediately the conversation moves from combative, where you're hurting each other, to emotionally connecting, where you're drawing closer to each other as you each express and articulate in a caring, loving, sensitive way what you're afraid of, what you're sad about, what you're grieving, and what you're mourning. So another huge thanks to Kara for
I might
sharing.
add with that too, don't hesitate to take some space too. Sometimes in anger, it can take a little, you may need some discharge time to be able to come back to vulnerability. And so don't hesitate to take a little bit of a break.
Lindy, our dear friend Lindy, why don't you read Lindy's comment?
I feel like no matter how far I am into the acceptance phase, because of life, it's easy to slide back to anger or depression. Announcements in the church, like the reversal of the 2015 policy, or things family members say of friends who leave you out, etc.
So how easy it is to get triggered or slide back into the phases. What do you think about that, Natasha?
Yeah, life doesn't stop, right? Because we've gone through these things. And even if we try to set up some boundaries, you're not going to be able to control what's on the news or what's happening in the church office building, right? Or what's happening maybe in some extended family circles. So those are real things that continue to trigger. And I think one of the reasons why, if anybody who's more on the believing spectrum is listening, one of the things that bothers transitioners the most is this idea that, these, angry post-Mormons, they just can't leave Mormonism alone, right? That's something that a lot of times more believing people will say, or that's one of the ways that believing people will explain this kind of sadness or angst that they feel from transitioning Mormons or post-Mormons, is a lot of this, is that people feel like, well, it's not that I can't leave Mormonism alone, it's that there's things happening within Mormonism that still affect me, whether I associate or go to church or not. And those things still cause these emotional responses in me. And so, yes, I respond. I'm not a robot, right? I respond to these things that the church or the community may not find triggering in of its, within, if you're within the tribe, but that are very upsetting if you're out or nuanced or transitioning. So that's a really interesting kind of dynamic, that when we're all still in relationship with one another, we will have many opportunities to feel these kinds of feels and learn from them, and hopefully, find ways to be more productive or effective, I guess, in dealing with these things.
Yeah.
I love it. Aaron writes, for me, the endless possibilities of not knowing, this is going back to the groundlessness conversation, the endless possibilities of not knowing can bring excitement and fear at the same time. That is totally true. For me, that ties into this theme of the gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. Is it can feel scary to not know everything and to not have, and to lose the certainty and the sense of superiority or whatever may have come with your feelings of Mormon orthodoxy. But what you can trade for that, again, is the excitement of endless possibilities in life if you're willing to go on a journey and go on an adventure. And Andrew adds, Ashley and I just spent a week in Vegas indulging some of those what ifs. It was perhaps more bonding than our wedding day. So Andrew is talking about how he and Ashley are finding that it's deepening and strengthening their marriage to have this ability to explore new possibilities, new ideas, new activities, new behaviors, whatever it is, as a way to strengthen and grow and enjoy new things together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, I think, that can be a positive side effect of of going through a faith transition. And then Andrew adds, my love for her is a direct result of giving up Mormonism. Go figure. So, and again, I had breakfast this morning with a man who, he and his wife, after 35 years, got divorced. It was super sad and tragic because they were in a mixed faith marriage, and it was just a bridge too far for their relationship. But he was sharing with me how he's found a new partner to date, and just how marvelous and lovely that experience has been for him to find someone who he feels is a lot more compatible with him. And again, that can be one of the joyful outgrowths of a faith transition that people experience.
I always feel like I'm the one that brings up Mormon stuff, and maybe I shouldn't do that as much, but one of the things that I really love about, I've always loved about, at least symbolically, is this idea that we have and even in just Mormon doctrine and understanding and how we talk about it, that joy and pain are inextricably interwoven, that we can't experience joy without experiencing pain. And even that goes back to the whole Garden of Eden story, about, like, to know means you're going to have to experience stuff, and so I think that there's something really beautiful in that symbology that I feel like we culturally don't practice very well, but that is there in our Mormon roots, that that we can then, maybe that's one of the things that we take with us. Carolyn Pearson, I love Carolyn Pearson's Pioneer poem, where she talks about, sometimes you have to, like, stop the wagon, reload it, pack it only with the precious things, and move on, right? And so that's a lot of how I have felt throughout my Mormon transition, is what do I want to still keep, even if it's symbolic in nature or beautiful for me and my own framings. It doesn't have to be literal. And I love that some of the ideas that I grew up learning about joy and pain being interwoven. And sometimes I think, especially with this topic of divorce and marriage, there's so many people that make mixed faith marriages work in beautiful, complex ways. There are people who divorce. I really don't like it when we see one of those as success or failure. We oftentimes have the narrative that divorce is a failure. We even talk about failed marriages in our, in our narrative, in our country. So I think that it's so much more complex than that. There's beauty and pain either way. You stay married, you're going to have pain and you're going to have joy. You get a divorce, you're going to have pain and you're going to have joy. Your kids are going to have pain and joy either way. And so making decisions not based on trying to avoid pain, but making decisions on how what's in our inability to know everything, which we don't. How do we assess risk and benefit the best we can and move forward in those spaces?
I love that. I love that insight. And I also love this idea of, in the acceptance that pain is part of the experience and intrinsically woven, interwoven with joy, is this idea that we gain a sense of, like, assuredness that we can navigate pain, that that fear starts to lessen in its ability to kind of control us, or we can, Elizabeth Gilbert always speaks about it like, fear has a place, it has a seat in my minivan, but it never ever touches the wheel. Meaning it will never, impact what I decide or to go. And I really love that idea. And it's been really helpful for me, I think. And that's part of what I loved about the groundlessness episode, is this idea that, we can get more comfortable in learning to navigate through these different terrains of life that, in many ways we're really young, we're very inexperienced at doing, but we can gain confidence. And there's tremendous freedom, I think, in feeling like, you're less afraid if you have to go there. It's like, well, I've been there before. It's not my favorite place to go, but I can do it.
That reminds me, there was an NPR article that somebody just, I think it was Amy Heffernan, just put on Facebook that talked about dealing with anxiety with kids and how oftentimes we want to help them with their anxiety by like taking care of them. Like, you know, if they're scared at night, it's like, well, climb into bed with me, honey, you know, or whatever. And not that you can't ever do that. But at the same time, they were talking about how it's really helping parents reinforce confidence in their children that's going to be the most helpful. So it's like, you got this, you can do this. And, you know, even if it's in like 5-minute increments for a while, or 10-minute increments with a small child. And so what you were talking about kind of reminded me of that, even with ourselves. It's like, we got this at some level, you know. And somebody mentioned Brene Brown's, you know, like embrace the suck. It's like we can embrace
the what?
Embrace
the suck.
Meaning what? Suck what?
Shelley Nazer says, yes, like Brene Brown says, embrace the suck. Like life
sucks or
like this thing sucks.
Embrace it.
Yeah.
And so, and so it's like, I think there's that whole idea of embracing pain and embracing discomfort, embracing ambiguity is all part of this grief cycle we've been talking about. And along with that opens up confidence that we can do it. We can survive discomfort. We can survive anxiety. We can survive grief.
Love it. All right. So here's a really good question that we've touched on in different ways, but let's hit it just really directly. How do we support others or ourselves going through a grief cycle? So, Margie, you've talked about pleasure. Is that right?
Pleasure, comfort, soothing.
Talked about comfort and acceptance. What do you think, Natasha? What are some ways we can support others or ourselves? Let's just say others. We notice someone's going through a grieving process. You know, believers grieve too. So as some of us celebrate, you know, our departure from the church in some instances, we still have to acknowledge that our parents or our siblings or our extended family or even our spouse may be grieving. So what can we do to support someone who's grieving?
Well, let me start with thinking about it individually first, and then maybe we can go to support others. You know, this is where I just kind of go back to my classic training of biopsychosocial. You know, it's like always remembering those three: biopsychosocial. So what's going on in my body, what's going on in my mind, and what's going on in my community, right? And where in those things are there places to improve, or are there opportunities to fill holes, like you like to say, John? So biology is like, how am I taking care of my body, right? Are there medicines I'm on or need to be on, or my diet, my exercise, my sleep, right? Like all of these things that kind of just affect how I manage my body. And some of those can be clinical things, and some of those can be more holistic things, right, that we do for ourselves. Psycho is, of course, my mental health, you know, so reframing, making sure I have cognitive ways of looking at this, mindfulness, you know, distractions, all of these things that we've talked about, coping mechanisms, you know, healthy ways to mentally function. How would I grade myself in that department? And then socially, how well, you know, what are my networks like? We know so much now that so much of our bio and psycho is affected by our social, right? So even when it comes to like substance dependence and all that, like number one thing that we're finding is that when you can connect with other people and you can feel part of a community and you can feel safe and validated and celebrated, whether you're LGBT or faith transitioning or whatever, you know, all these groups, support groups, like grief groups, you know, they all exist for a reason, you know, as far as really giving people a place to belong. So where am I at in that department? Have I found, and that can be a big one in faith transition, because a lot of times we lose community. So then, you know, when we then, think about supporting other people in when we see them grieving, it can be helpful to kind of see other people through those three lenses, you know. How are they taking care of their body? And not that it's my job to tell somebody how to take care of their body, right? But how might I have some empathy if I see somebody who has little sleep, you know, stressed out at a job, dealing with my faith transition, like how can I have some empathy for, right now they're maybe in a spot where they're not able to take care of their body as well as they'd like, or, maybe just had a baby or whatever. How are they doing in the psychology aspect, and how are they doing socially? And of course, socially is where we can have the most impact in another person's life, is how do I create a space where I can be part of their support network? Or if I can't for some reason, like there's just too many divides, how do I lovingly bow out or create some boundaries so that I'm not hurting this process more in the than I should? Maybe with my anger rants, right? Or my Facebook comments, or there's so many ways where we hurt each other. I think, when I think about what I've been bluesy about, not that it's the whole thing, but I think the comment sections and several things that I've been a part of in these last few weeks have definitely not helped my bluesy aura. We are just so awful to each other in comment sections of blogs and articles and
Twitter,
the BYU grad, just things about General Conference, and since I write a blog and since I do things, I'm always, aware of comments, and it's just so hard. So sometimes maybe we can just bow out instead of feeling like we've got to teach everybody our way. And that's hard to do sometimes as transitioners because we feel so marginalized to begin with. It's hard not to want to get in there and say, hey, this isn't right how you guys are doing this. But I think it's a big part of self-care, and it's also part of other cares, maybe to bow out sometimes.
Yeah, that circle of influence a little bit. It also kind of reminds me of Brene Brown. She has have you read this part, Natasha, where it's the list, where she has you write down your people who are kind of there for you, who love you unconditionally, who when you fall down, they're the ones that kind of pick you back up and tell you, but they also tell you hard things. They're the ones that also will kind of, and she always, I think she says you should maybe have 2 to 5 people. It's not a very long list for people. And when you get
you're allowed to care about what they think about you,
particularly in the ring. And the other thing is, these people have to be in the ring with you. That we don't take feedback from people who aren't in the ring doing the work, equally vulnerable, equally. But if with all that in common, it's essentially being able to say to people who are, criticizing you or saying really that you can say, you're not on my list emotionally. You're not on my list. I won't, this will not penetrate because, and I think that's a very a healthy paradigm to have in these days where social media, it can be treacherous. It can be merciless with people who are really in the ring trying to do, not perfect because no one is. So they're in the ring kind of getting messy, trying to do some good out there.
Yeah, I love Brene Brown's thoughts about support networks and knowing who to trust, who to be vulnerable with, all of those kinds of things. She has a lot of really great work around boundaries. I always recommend her stuff. Another theory, it's called ring theory, which kind of goes along with this a little bit, but it's also knowing where you are in the ring of trauma. So if somebody's going through a loss, right? They're kind of in the middle. And so if they're sharing that loss with you, you're kind of the first ring out, right? So you're in that ring of that trauma. The person, whoever's gone through the trauma is trusting you with their information. And it's not appropriate then to be the one who then goes back and makes that person have to deal with your stuff. So you have to find somebody outside of that ring to now, because maybe now you're going through vicarious trauma. This is especially true, like think about sexual assault, right? You have a friend who tells you they've been raped, right? And so, but now in telling you, you're having a huge emotional reaction. You're crying and, oh my gosh, how could this have happened to you? And now, so this person who needs your help is now taking care of you.
Right.
Because you are having vicarious trauma and knowing something of that significance has happened to your friend, which is a normal response, but we don't want to put that on the person who needs our support. So your job then is to find somebody in the next ring down to find, to find support, your own support for that, so that you can be a main support person for the person who's primary in the ring. So faith transitions are kind of like that. You know, who do you tell? Who does that person then focus on? And I think this becomes a really big mess when the vicarious trauma is, especially for the believer, right? So if your person that you tell is your spouse who's a believer, well, now they're traumatized too by this whole process, and they want to engage with you who's wounded.
Right.
And this is where you get a lot of these dynamics where I hear people saying things like, why are you siding with the church that's hurting me, right? And the believer's like, wait a minute, why are you, you know, and we get into these vicarious trauma kind of cycles that are not very helpful. So know where you're at in the ring.
Yeah, self-awareness. Yeah.
Shelley's a new listener. She writes, I'm new here, but can't we still believe we will be together in whatever comes next? Meaning the afterlife, I think. It doesn't have to be the Mormon definition, but maybe there is comfort in creating our own beliefs, or maybe call them hope, but it could still be a possibility without all the rules and limitations. Maybe you don't need those and you can still be together forever. Isn't that sweet? And
this is reclaiming.
And then Emily writes, Shelley, it depends on where your faith crisis takes you. My husband and I believe more secularly now. Putting aside the actual theology of this question, which in and of itself is a great one and an interesting one, I really love that Shelley is reinforcing something that occurs to me as being a tendency we have to add more grief than is necessary. What I mean by that is, you know, there are many things that we, and Natasha, you touched on this earlier today, there are many things that we are and did and believed as Mormons, and when we lose our faith or we stop going to church, sometimes all those things that we believed and thought and did become infected to where we kind of don't want anything to do with Mormonism, whether it's the beliefs or the practices or the people or whatever. And I think that can sometimes introduce unnecessary suffering. And so, like you, Natasha, one of my first pieces of advice to progressive and post-Mormons is keep the good, which means if God's working for you, keep God. If attending church is working for you, keep church. If the word of wisdom or, you know, avoiding alcohol and drugs or being monogamous, if that's working for you, keep it. You don't have to throw it away. And if the belief in an afterlife is working for you, why in the heck would you want to get rid of that? Keep it. And so what Shelley, I think, is reminding us of is that we don't have to throw everything out. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are many, 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 many believers, or sorry, many, many, many non-believers or post-Mormons who I tell, if church is working for you, keep going to church. If it's a great social support for you, if it's working for your spouse, if you think it provides good structure for your kids, if you've got friends there, if it helps you be a better person, by all means, why would you stop going? Keep going to church. Now, of course, there are many people that just can't do that over time. But I think what Shelley's saying in an abstract way is, why can't we just keep all the good and not throw away unnecessarily the things that are working for us to live in the gray, to live in a multicolored spectral world, and to make your life your own, which might include keeping some or much of your prior beliefs or practices or behaviors if they work for you.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. This to me is kind of the joy part, because this is where you're actually creating a new paradigm, whether that be beliefs or values, and the truth is they'll be as, you know, different as we are. They'll look very different from one another. And the key part is just that it reflects you, that, you know, in the end, this is actually an intentional, conscious process. And that you are now internal. You're doing the work from the inside to determine who you are and, you know, what you believe or what your values are now, and to have it reflect you. So it's really beautiful.
The word that comes to mind for me that's kind of a mental health term is integration with what she is saying. And we talk a lot about this with like LGBT Q plus individuals, members who are in the church, but maybe want to remain members of the church and want to nuance their belief system in a way that's healthy for them, if they're going to identify and integrate their orientation into their religious structure. And so when we talk about integration, it's kind of like, you can't stay in these black and white boxes. You can't be like, it's all this or it's all that, because then it requires you to sell short a huge aspect of yourself. And so where I see this really mattering for faith transitioners is that most of us, we're transitioning or we're rethinking or we're reworking things because there's a part of our experience that doesn't totally fit into the boxes provided. And so then that's work that we're doing, is having to reintegrate our belief system. And this actually is part of like research that's been done around religious people, that they talk about this reinterpretation of religious teachings as a form of moving towards health integration if you're going to stay involved with a religious community. So that people who do that in a healthy way don't tend to have black and white, literal types of relationships with their faith structure. So I think I forget the name of the person who commented, but what she's exemplifying right in her comment is that ability to do that for herself. Mm-hmm. That she's exemplifying, I'm going to rethink about this. I'm going to maybe abstract it a little bit. I'm not going to be as rigid. It's still useful to me. I love this idea of being able to be together forever. I agree. I love that idea too. That brings me a lot of comfort personally. For some people it doesn't. For me it does. And so how do you reclaim those things and reintegrate them in a way that also makes room for your lived experience? And some people can do that within the church and some people can't, because the integration requires spirituality outside of what the Mormon church can provide. So that's fine too. That's another way to reintegrate yourself.
Absolutely.
And Natasha, will you read, while you're at it, Millie's most recent comment? We got a great comment from Millie.
I can relate in so many ways. Keep the good. My faith transition is from Roman Catholicism to Protestantism. It is like leaving a culture, and we are keeping so many of our beliefs, but not the ritual. I appreciate y'all's videos.
How cool is it that we have a faith transitioner from Catholicism to Protestantism that listens to the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis?
These are not unique processes, people. I keep trying to tell people this is not a Mormon problem. We definitely have our own unique niches in Mormonism, but there are plenty of faith transitions going around in all different kinds of communities.
But still, shout out to Millie. Millie, you're awesome. I want to interview you for Mormon Stories podcast, which is another cool podcast, because it'd be fun to learn about your transition. All right, so we are just struggling to get to. We have so many questions and comments. One person writes, "How does Richard Rohr's order, disorder, and reorder fit into this framework?" And I love that someone is doing a shout out to Richard Rohr. I'm not by any means a Richard Rohr expert. We would call on Dan Witherspoon or Jana Spengler or Gina Colvin or others. Maybe we should have them on to talk about Richard Rohr. Maybe we should try and get a hold of Richard Rohr himself. What I will say is I've read his book, Falling Upward, and he does this, reframing is probably a really relevant concept for this notion of grieving. And basically Richard Rohr has this concept, and I believe I talked about this last week, of first half of life and second half of life that I think provides a lot of meaning to a faith crisis that almost makes it sound and feel like it's exactly the thing that we should be doing in our life. And basically, to try and summarize what Richard Rohr says, is the first half of your life you spend building up who you are, your personality, your resources, your education, your ego strength. And it's almost as if you're building a container for the wisdom and the depth and all the personal insight and beliefs that you can spend your life pursuing. But the first half of your life is spent following a belief system that's been handed to you that prepares you for the maturity level and the wisdom level to then be able to go on your own exploration. It's kind of like you wouldn't want to go on a safari as a 2-year-old or as a 1-year-old, but once you're 20 or 30, you may be strong enough, fast enough, healthy enough, wise enough to go on that journey. And Richard Rohr basically says, no matter what faith tradition you're raised in, and that includes Catholicism, because Richard Rohr, I believe, is a Franciscan monk. Richard Rohr says no matter what faith tradition you were raised in, it will ultimately prove inadequate to you, and you will have a faith crisis, even if it's atheism or agnosticism or secularism. You know, how cliche is it for Mormon missionaries to convert people who are raised in secular households because they didn't get the meaning and the fulfillment and the structure and the community that they needed to feel fully happy and healthy. So even if you're raised in a secular household or Catholic or Mormon or whatever, you're going to inevitably have a faith crisis. That's how it's meant to be. And once you start that second half of life, you've got this amazing resource of your ego, yourself having been built, your education, your socioeconomic status, your friendships, your community, etc. You now have the ability, the strength, the resources, much like a 30 or 40-year-old would have over a 2-year-old. You now have the strength and the wisdom and the resources to spend the rest of your life filling that vessel with wisdom and joy and meaning and purpose and strength and identity. And I just think Richard Rohr, even though he borrows a lot on Christian scripture, on Christian story, on Christian metaphor, he provides us with a lot of wisdom to help reframe a faith crisis, again, from some tragedy to simply maturation, to maturity, to sort of a passageway to depth and meaning that was intended all the way along somehow by some great designer in the sky, male or female or non-gendered. That is my response. Anything you guys want to add about Richard Rohr?
No.
Natasha?
I love to say that I think faith transitions are just inevitable. I've been saying that for a long time. Even, I think sometimes we think of faith transition, the only outcome is you leave the church. You know, and that is definitely one big faith transition. It's a huge one. It's a lot of what we deal with here at Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. At the same time, anytime you think of a believer, and I have had these experiences where I was in the temple or I was listening to a conference address or a talk or listening to a hymn, and you have a new aha moment, a moment where you feel like enlightened in a new way, or you have an experience that you never thought of. That's in essence a little tiny faith transition. That's re-looking at your framing in a new way. And this is supposed to happen over and over and over again. And I think what Richard Rohr is doing with this order, disorder, reorder is really looking at it through a developmental lens that is so much about what we're doing in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And that's, each one of those decades has its own developmental process where we are supposed to be rethinking things. We're not supposed to be on autopilot. Mm-hmm. Autopilot is not a good long-term strategy. It can help us during stressful times. It's probably a healthy place to be, like late 20s, early 30s when you're raising littles, but it's not a space where you're supposed to stay.
Mm-hmm. Love that. A couple comments that I see here that have really stood out to me. Judy writes, "This is such a powerful experience. I have vivid memories of my processing. Thankfully, now able to move forward peacefully. It is essential to take time to go through the stages, back and forth if needed. Take all the time you need. For me, my personal therapy during this time and even now included journaling, talking to my husband, crying, drinking too much at times and then sobbing. I also used exercise, time alone, screaming in my car on occasion, and writing burning letters to whomever, Joseph Smith, my stake president, etc. It was a powerful, soul-wrenching, growing experience. in the end, I decided to trust myself instead of the church. So a comment from Judy. Another one, Bree writes, I've learned to lean into whatever stage I'm feeling, label the feeling that I have and carefully observe it while it's there, rather than trying to push it away or talk myself out of it. Things tend to ebb and flow rather than overwhelm me this way, and I feel peace even when I'm feeling furious.
I love that. I'm going to continue to read a few of these because I just think it's nice to have people's experiences.
Yeah, great.
Emily says the point about a TBM, so a true believing Mormon, going through grief after a loved one leaves is very accurate. When my husband left 5 years before me, I definitely went through every phase of grief. I felt like I was mourning a dream that had been crushed. I felt betrayed by both my husband and God. Understanding that loved ones are also hurting can hopefully help those exiting the church to have more compassion and empathy for the ones we're leaving that are still in. And Lindy writes, I feel like the depression stage lasted the longest for me, especially after I had my baby a year ago. With all my other kids, I would feed and rock my babies and sing primary songs. I'm a child of God. I love to see the temple, child's prayer. With my youngest, I found myself out of habit wanting to sing those same songs and finding myself just in tears, mourning the loss of the knowledge I had and all the uncertainty and fear of not knowing. Now I'm past that stage and well into acceptance and moving forward. But that experience is still very triggering, and I rock and feed my baby to sleep 3 times a day still. So, and you can see some of the intersection there with, baby making. I mean, postpartum depression, just the hormonal surges, even if you don't necessarily qualify for postpartum depression, but the hormonal surges of having a baby, breastfeeding, having small children, being exhausted in the small children phase. If you're going through a faith transition during that time, that's a very interesting intersection in of itself.
Absolutely. And that uncertainty and fear,
especially for little ones.
Yeah,
that you're worried about
having this new baby that you so want to protect and offer, I think, some sense of grounding.
Stability and structure too. Mm-hmm. And then Sydney says, oh, sorry, I'll say one more and then I'll let.
That was the one I was going to read.
So. Go ahead then, Margie.
No, you go ahead.
All right, so Sydney says, for me, it seemed like I jumped all around the stages of the grief chart. Just when I thought I was done with the anger stage, it would rear its ugly head again, and I would be back in the middle of the anger stage again. I guess my tip would be to not expect to follow each stage and then think, well, I felt that emotion now, so I can check it off. And you can bounce all around that chart, and it's okay. I would get so down on myself and think I should be moving and healing past that particular stage once I felt that emotion. Remember to be kind and patient with yourself. And this is where I love to tease us as Mormons. Like we're doers, we're list makers, we're bees in the hive. We're, give me a list and I'll make sure and go through it. And so let's watch our Mormon DNA, kind of like our tendencies, right? To take a list like the grief cycle and say, I've got it. I'm going to listen to this podcast, and Margie, Natasha, and John, they gave me some good tips, and now I'm going to go get this done.
Right. So true.
The opposite approach is probably what's needed.
So true.
Matt writes something really valuable. He writes, somewhere in there, we need to find our role in it, a way to see our part. Let it go and forgive. Our enemies need our forgiveness. We can forgive and love even if we don't like them. Lots of fear dealing with dogma and doctrine. I have faith in a higher power that looks a lot different than the one I grew up with. So really quickly, 2 things that I think may be misunderstood or that others may struggle with a little bit that Matt talks about. Number 1 is finding our role in it. It is so common for us who have felt hurt by the church or deceived by the church or damaged by the church to be angry at the church and to feel like we're victims, right? To feel like we've been victimized by the church. So what in the world could Matt mean by our role, finding our role in it? Do we have a role or are we victims? Or both?
Binary, you.
So to Natasha and Margie, how could we have had a role in this faith crisis?
Well, I
silence.
guess I know I'm trying to kind of understand the question maybe a little bit, but I think I'm not sure if it's, I mean, I think we all have a role in our faith crisis in the sense that it's our mind and it's our body that's going through the experience. At the same time, we don't have the role in the sense of, I think, necessarily choosing what our mind decides to think about, right? So we have this weird interplay between thoughts and information that kind of comes at us, and there's not a lot of choice in that. But then we do play a role in how we manage that information, how we go forward. And some of that even can feel like you don't have a lot of choice. Like, I don't think most people would say I chose to have a faith transition, you know, just like I didn't choose to all of a sudden not believe in Santa Claus. It's like new information came and all of a sudden I had to deal with a new reality. But now I do have to look at my role in moving forward in that new reality. And I think that's where we go from victims to survivors. You know, when you think about like trauma work, you know, a lot of sexual assault survivors, for example, don't want to be seen as victims, or maybe sometimes they do. Like, no, I was a victim. Like, that's a serious thing. And I was a victim. And at some point, however, I want to claim my survivor status. So even, again, depending on the person you talk to, will have different relationships with those words of being a victim or being a survivor. I think that what this gentleman is inviting us to think about is, how do we move forward in health? What role do we have in that? What areas of control do we have? Mm-hmm. And I think that is, in a sense, what we're inviting everybody to think about through these podcasts is where do we have control going forward? Not that we're going to have control over which phase we're in necessarily, but when we recognize we do have control, some control about self-awareness just by being willing. We have some control about behavior. We have some control in regards to communication with other people, self-care. And so what role do we want to play? And then if he mentioned forgiveness, we do talk about this. And I think we talked about this maybe in that first episode, John, that you mentioned last time too, is that how do we at some point be willing to enter into a space of gratitude for where we come from? And that, I do think, is playing a role towards maturity, emotional maturity, spiritual maturity, that and also maybe what we can talk a little bit more about in a what if episode, because it's very easy to just get angry at this system, this organization, but it lacks a face a little bit. It's so complex, it's so systemic, and it's so true of so many systems, you know, like the woman who grew up Catholic and now considers herself a Protestant. She also was a product of her environment, of her system. So at some point we have to like move forward in I think gracious ways. And I think that's a role that we can all consider.
Yeah. It's a great response. What she said, what Natasha said right there.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
A lot of times this idea of forgiveness is also hard, because I think forgiveness can be really hard. And it's especially hard because in the case of the church, they're not asking for forgiveness. In fact, they've said we neither give nor seek apologies, right? And so that, for some, that may make it more complicated, because there are abusers who don't ever apologize, but then there's abusers that apologize. But how do you forgive, in this case, an institution that isn't even caring about whether you forgive them or not? Is that more difficult?
I feel like the forgiveness is more for you,
Yeah, I have a very hate-love relationship with the word forgiveness.
Yeah.
I think it comes with a lot of baggage, especially from religious communities. It comes with a lot of expectation. Yeah. And I think it's the number one reason why people have poor boundaries, is because they feel like they need to be forgiving without realizing that healthy forgiveness includes a lot of boundaries, meaning you may not have a relationship with somebody who abuses you again, and you can still be in a space of forgiveness. I think a lot of times forgiveness to a lot of people means I am now okay with you hurting me. Right. And so I need to continue to still let you be in my life.
Yep.
And that's a really unhealthy definition of forgiveness.
Yes.
So for me, forgiveness, if you want to use that word, or reconciliation or whatever, it's about, I will no longer give you the power to have the narrative about my relationship with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I will have grace for your existence because things exist that hurt us. And I will not allow that to have a say in how I move forward.
That's right. I love that.
But when it comes to Mormonism, I think, it's a big train we were on. I think all of us are on it. Sure, I can be mad at Nelson or Oakes or nitpick about things that they say and continue to hurt people. At the same time, they're products of the train as well. Mormonism is much bigger than any one person or thing. Even Joseph Smith, it's much bigger than that because it's a conglomerate of community. And we were all part of that community, whether through conversion or through being born into a system that had it. And that's what I'm saying, making peace with the fact that all of us are born into something imperfect, something that will inevitably betray and harm us. I don't know of any system that exists in the world that does. Now, some systems do it poorer or worse than others. So there is that. And Mormonism is a bit more on the rigid spectrum of things. But I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about forgiveness. It's recognizing, kind of like we do with our parents, like at some level you stop thinking of your parents the way you did when you were 8.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, yeah, then you go through like the teenage phase where you're like, at 8, you think, oh my gosh, my parents are amazing. At 15, you're like, my parents are idiots. Who the hell do they think they are?
Mm-hmm.
And then hopefully by the time you're 27 and having kids of your own, you're like, I see you. I see where you had weaknesses. I see where you struggled. I see where you let me down. And I recognize I do a lot of those things too. And I have a lot of room to grow. And I'm going to build my relationship from there. It's a much more gracious space, I think.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautifully said, Natasha.
Well, thank you, Margie. I love you too. John, just go away. Me and Margie are going to talk for a minute.
Yeah, I'm not really needed here. That's okay. No, that's beautiful. Lots of listeners wrote really beautiful comments and suggestions, and we're just not going to have time to get to them all today. And we're kind of running out of time. So I just want to say there's so much. I will read one suggestion from Lindy. She writes, other than listening to podcasts that were truly helpful during my faith crisis, the best thing that I did for myself was attend a faith crisis workshop. It was honestly the first time throughout my entire transition that I felt validated, normal, and loved for what I had gone through. Finding a support system from people who went through the same thing I did was so cathartic and helpful. I'm so grateful for people like Natasha and John who dedicate their time to helping others get through the most difficult thing that most people will ever go through. So huge thanks to Lindy. And Lindy didn't just sort of stop and feel that way. She said, hey, John, I want to work with you to help make these workshops and retreats possible. And Lindy, along with a few other people, have been the backbones of this Thrive event that's coming up in June. So Lindy's putting her money, so to speak, where her mouth is, and she's donating to help make this workshop available. And I just want to second that as we're coming to the close of this episode. These workshops and retreats are transformative, and the things that are shared by people like Margie and me and Natasha and all the other speakers, what they share is only a small part of what you're going to get. What you're going to get from these events is validation. You're going to feel less crazy. You're going to feel less alone. You're going to find friends, sometimes lifelong friends, and you're going to find community. And you're going to have all sorts of emotional side benefits to attending these events. And that's why we do them. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of stress. It's a lot of pain. And in the case of this event, there's literally no financial gain, but we just know they help people. And so again, if you haven't checked out thrivebeyondmormonism.com, there are about 70 slots left for anyone who wants to come. And we really want to encourage you to take advantage of that. And we think you will find it transformative as we have. Anything else, Natasha, you want to say about grief or grieving?
No, it's a part of life. It does suck sometimes. Embrace the suck. And, hopefully we can, through knowing each other and participating in venues like this, we can be part of our support systems that we all need to move forward in healthy, productive ways that include discomfort, vulnerability, ambiguity, and not always being happy, happy, happy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What do you want to add, Margie?
I'm feeling very at peace with that episode.
Beautiful. We have several people requesting workshops in their area. Rochelle's requesting something in Washington. Others are wanting things in Arizona. Nevada's a place we often go. Idaho. There are several places in Utah. If you want to have a workshop or a retreat in your area, you just need to do as Lindy did, step up, email us at mormonfaithcrisis@gmail.com and say, I'm willing to help you organize and recruit for this event. And if you can do that, we will do our part to make them possible. And Chicago,
numbers, right? You kind of need a certain
we
amount
need
of...
at least 20 people to make these events possible. Chicago, we want to come there, lots of different places. So just help us make it possible and we'll do it. All right. Is that it for today?
I think that's it.
Well, we want to give a huge shout out of thanks to our listeners, everyone who's joined us live. You guys, your comments and questions make everything possible. Everyone who wrote in, thank you so much for your comments and tips. We wish we had time to read everything you guys shared. There's so many things, good things that people share. We appreciate everyone who makes this possible. Thanks to the Open Stories Foundation. Thanks to Cody Layton, who does our post-production. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks to all the donors who make Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis and the Open Stories Foundation possible. We couldn't do it without you. If you value this content, please consider becoming a monthly donor. Go to mormonfaithcrisis.com, click on the donate button. 10, 20, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. It will go towards making these podcasts affordable so that we can keep providing them. And know that you won't just be helping people now. Your contributions will go towards helping people in the future. So it's a way to pay forward what you're getting from this content. So please consider supporting us financially. And now, because we're part of the Open Stories Foundation, your donations are tax deductible. If you are already a donor, make sure and sign up for the new donations to the Open Stories Foundation. We'll cancel your past donations, and that way you can make sure and get your tax credit for supporting what we do. So yeah, and if you have, there are lots of other ways you can support us as well. You can like us on Facebook. You can subscribe to us on YouTube. You can give us positive reviews on Facebook or on iTunes. You can share these episodes with other people. There are just lots of ways that you can support us. So thanks everyone who supports us, and please tune in again soon for another episode of the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. Margie, you're awesome. I love you.
Love you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Natasha.
Natasha, you're brilliant.
Great.
Until next time.
As always, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much for everything.
We'll see you next week.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.